Hello, I'm Suzanne Yvette, and this is Alternate Perspective. This show is about shining a light on all things alternative and community-driven by providing a platform for spiritual, activist, and countercultural work for people with this type of work to have an opportunity to connect with the community. This episode is a continuation of the panel we had last episode. Again, we will have Michael Downey introducing us and moderating.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back for a second time on your show. And I would like to introduce our panelists. So on my far right is Dr. David Keel, who is an associate professor at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And Terence has a joint appointment in the departments of history and Black Studies. Next to Terence is Dr. David Krieger, who is a co-founder and president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And right beside me is Dr. Vilna Bashi-Treitler, who is also a UCSB professor and the chair of the Department of Black Studies. So I would like to briefly restate some of the issues that you raised in our first appearance on the show. And starting with you, Terence, you had a fascinating perspective on King, and you said that we are presented with two versions of King. One who is associated with the I Have a Dream speech, the King who's associated with a colorblind society, and then you said there's a more radical version of King, the King who talked about the Vietnam War, relating it to capitalism and racism. And so you concluded your comments by posing the idea of which king we want to memorialize. David, you also made reference to King's 1967 speech, and you focused on militarism and Dr. King's concern with that. And you also said that he gave that speech about Vietnam as a matter of consciousness, and that he gave that speech even though he was advised against doing so, because at that time, Lyndon Johnson was a friend of the civil rights movement, and he was perceived as someone who was needed to advance civil rights legislation. And then finally, Vilna, you talked about racism and white supremacy, and you talked about the fact that we are having to have that discussion, and that perhaps 5 years ago that would not have been necessary. And you talked about race as a social construct, and that it was created by people who create a human hierarchy and put themselves at the top of that structure. So with those things in mind, I would like to ask you all if you can talk about any positive developments that are happening that show the promise of positive changes in our world.
I think that we might look at, and the degree to which what we mean by positive is probably up for debate here. I think it's worth also ruminating a little bit more about what the challenges that we're facing and the kinds of activism that those challenges are inspiring and trying to sort of create in terms of social change. So we might think of the Black Lives Matter movement on one hand, and we might also think about the rallying of immigrants across this nation right now as Trump has sort of done away with DACA, and over 800,000 are sort of in legal limbo about their citizenship. I think, if we want to say positive, is there's a spirit still within this country to sort of fight for a more robust understanding of citizenship, to fight against the militarization of our local police, for example, which militarization was something that we all talked about in our last panel as something that King himself saw as sort of antithetical to democracy. Right? The policing of black and brown bodies in cities that have deteriorated, right? Where resources have been pulled out of these cities as a result of neoliberalism. The Black Lives Matter movement is a way of calling attention to the fact that King's dream has not been realized. And so I think it's really important to see that these movements have an awareness of a kind of historical legacy behind them. I think also the call for a more robust conception of citizenship that we're seeing right now with debates over DACA are really about who is an American, right? This is a country illegitimately founded right, by a bunch of illegitimate immigrants who took land from Native Americans, right? This is a nation state that is essentially has had open borders, allowing immigrants to come who revitalize our cities, who give us sort of values and commitments. Citizenship is always a moving target, and I think it's a very healthy thing to see that these sort of public debates are going to happen right now, particularly with young students who have been committed to living in this country as proper Americans and simply want to be recognized with the rights that they are deserved.
I'd like to say something positive about what's going on with nuclear weapons abolition in the world. Just today, the day we're taping, a new treaty called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was open for signatures at the United Nations. In July, that treaty was adopted by 122 out of 124 countries that negotiated the treaty. Today, already, on the first day that it was open for signatures, there were 50 countries that signed. So I think that's, on the one hand, impressive, but I have to add a footnote to that, perhaps an important footnote, which is that none of the 9 nuclear-armed countries participated in the negotiations, and the United States, Britain, and France said they will not sign or be a party to it in any way, and essentially boycotted and denounced the treaty. So what that suggests to me is a positive step on the part of most of the world, most of the non-nuclear weapons states in the world, but a negative sign on the part of the nuclear weapons possessing countries and their allies in NATO, for example, or Japan and South Korea, for example. So there's two opposing trends going on in the world now, with most of the world wanting to end the danger that nuclear weapons pose to humanity by abolishing these weapons, and the 9 countries that have these weapons, pretty much led by the United States, wanting to continue the status quo and be in a position to threaten to use nuclear weapons, as Donald Trump did in his speech the other day to the United Nations, in which he said, we will, if threatened, we will destroy North Korea. Can you imagine an American president going to the United Nations and threatening to destroy another nation?
Wow, couldn't before yesterday.
Now it's all too realizable. I want to conclude with just one more quote by Martin Luther King that I think is very relevant to what I just said or told about. We can learn to live together as brothers or all perish as fools. Those are essentially our choices in the nuclear age. And I would say to realize the choice of living together as brothers requires reconceptualizing democracy and taking the kind of steps you talked about, Terence.
Well, I too see 2 sides, and to me it's very positive that the authoritarian sympathizers that seem to want to fatigue us have not succeeded. What I looked at in preparing to join this second segment of the panel was what resistance to that looks like. And you mentioned Black Lives Matter. It seems that the number of protests that have happened since the election have been really phenomenal. And the size, the intensity, the varied issues that have been covered, the Women's March, LGBTQ issues, border wall, DACA, I wrote these down, sanctuary cities, Day Without Immigrants, the tax march, science march. We've had so many issues covered. And as I said, it seems to be that there's a new development every week, every day, and we haven't given up. We haven't been fatigued. We're still fighting to save health care for the umpteenth time, and we've so far, knock wood, we're doing just fine. So I hope we continue to stand up for each other. I think that's a very positive development. And I'd love to see people continue. There's so many ways to get involved. Calling your representatives, being out on the street, writing letters, help your neighbor, register to vote, and then go out and vote. There are lots of things we could continue to do. I hope we do them.
I could add to that that the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation has an action alert network that you can get involved in. And you can get a free monthly newsletter from the foundation called The Sunflower on all things nuclear.
That's cute.
And you can find those and sign up for those at wagingpeace.org.
I would say also that this Trump era, I think, has done many things for us, particularly those on the left. But I think it's made it really clear that America is a participatory sport, which is to say that it's not to be involved in democratic politics involves a kind of activism and commitment. And I would encourage people to get involved in your local organizations, get involved with grassroots organizations who are dealing with single-payer options, for example, here in California, who are dealing with DACA and immigration issues, for example. There are many organizations within our local communities that are doing the work of democracy, and they need participants. They need young, youthful energy. They need a kind of commitment to sort of sustain these movements.
Another interesting thing in Trump's speech to the United Nations was that he started off by bragging about the U.S. stock market being at the highest levels it's been. And then a few more sentences into the speech, he bragged about the United States spending more than $700 billion on so-called defense. And that's worth taking note of because we're getting new airplanes. In the United States, we're planning to spend $1 trillion on upgrading our nuclear arsenal, and we can't seem to find the money to do infrastructure, healthcare, inner city, so many things that need care and support in our society.
I think that's a really great point. I mean, if you think about Hurricane Harvey, for example, which devastated Houston, and we know that there are communities that were adversely affected as a result of poor policy decision-making about allocating resources for natural disasters. We might think about cities like Detroit, for example, that have literally been forgotten by the federal government and local government. These are places that used to be sort of an international sort of city that gave us Motown, that was sort of the site of sort of the automotive industry that have largely been forgotten, right? And so there's a kind of powerful contradiction where there's sort of, on the one hand, sort of global militarization led by the United States, sort of an arms race, as you say, simultaneously with this sort of unrestrained capitalism that largely ignores sort of local infrastructure, the very site of American democracy, and this is a real problem.
I think what you're talking about was captured in something that Martin Luther King Jr. said, which is we need to convert the arms race into a peace race. and participating is a way of engaging in the work of peace, which is broad work, peace with justice.
Sure, yes. And I also think that, we spoke a little earlier about King's 1967 speech on the Vietnam War, and he draws attention to the fact that there is a powerful contradiction where poor inner city black and brown bodies are being drafted to fight a military effort globally, and an effort that sort of expands American imperialism, so that you have systemic racial injustice producing the labor for a kind of neoliberal sort of global expansion project. That's a problem. And King says that sort of democracy really can't thrive until we actually confront racial injustice here on the domestic front. So I think engagement is important. Understanding the nature of the problem is also equally valuable, right? And this gets us back to thinking about what King do we want to memorialize, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Well, it makes me think of how King very specifically linked militarism and spending on foreign wars with poverty here in our nation. And, you kind of mentioned the way the way inequality is structured. It's feeding the war machine. I think, we still haven't solved the Flint water crisis. We still haven't addressed childhood hunger. There are so many ways that we could be investing in our own people, and I wish that the people we've elected to represent us locally and in Congress and the way our democracy works, the president would really heed those needs and think about what I think the United States should be standing for, which is, the amalgam of people that we have and how we can bring that together to be a brighter future. I think that's really what we stand for, and I hope we continue to stand for that.
And I think King, I think one of his underlying messages is that we need to have some kind of spiritual and social uplift. That comes, I think, from his religious background, the spiritual uplift. But he pointed out on many occasions, that our spiritual perspectives, our spiritual capacities are falling way below our technological capacities. And that's what puts us in such a dangerous position.
Yes.
And puts the world
Yes.
in that dangerous position.
And it looks like our time is about up, so thank you so much, everyone. All right, well, again, our pleasure to be here, and thank you for having us.
Pleasure to have you.
All right.
All right, so this was a continuation of the panel in our last episode. We will transition to the segment with Michelle Lawyer, and she's doing Let There Be Peace and Down by the Riverside.
us walk with each other in perfect harmony. Let peace begin with me. Let this be the moment now. With every step I take, let this be my solemn vow to take each moment and live each moment in peace eternally. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. Let peace begin with me. Let this be the moment now. With every step I take, let this be my solemn vow to take each moment and live each moment in peace eternally. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. Gonna lay down my burdens down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Gonna lay down my burdens down by the riverside. Gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. 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 Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside, by that old riverside. Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. Gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I don't wanna study war no more. So I ain't gonna study war no more. 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 I don't wanna study war no more. You don't wanna study war no more. We don't wanna study war no more. So ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more.
We just came back from our segment. We had a wonderful cover of Let There Be Peace and Down by the Riverside by Michelle Loyer. This episode was a part of the second part of the panel. The next episode will deal with a root worker who will explain to us hoodoo. So please continue watching, and happy to have you.